Hello and welcome to the CX Files for 12th of May 2022. My name is Mark Hillary and I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil.
And I'm Peter Ryan, based in Montreal, Canada. Mark, great to be here on the 12th of May. It's always exciting to kick off a new episode of the CX Files.
Well, fantastic to be back and to see you again. And you're back in a yellow shirt once again. It must be a theme.
Well, it is a theme. This yellow shirt is actually commemorating the university where I was awarded my MBA, Dalhousie in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Big shout out to Halifax and all the Maritimers. Many friends out there. It's a great part of the world and really exciting to be here today, Mark, because we've got a fantastic interview with Faye Joubert. Now, Faye is based in Johannesburg, a city that you and I both know well. And she is the head of CRM for iSON, which is a leading BPO provider in South Africa. Faye comes to the table with a great deal of experience, having worked both with outsourcing partners as well as having been on the enterprise side. And what we talk about today is really the future of the relationships that enterprises and outsourcers should be expecting to have with each other. And I know, Mark, you've done interviews with people from the BPO community most recently who've had their own opinions on this. Faye, I think, brings a dose of realism in terms of where she sees these types of engagements going. And I think given the fact that we look to be coming out of a post-pandemic period, coming into the post-pandemic period, and there's going to be definitely a shakeup in terms of how outsourcing relationships go, it was really good to get her pearls of wisdom today.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember writing about this industry like 20 years ago, and that's at the height of the your mess for less kind of comparison. You know, you'd see the comparisons of different BPOs, and at the end of the day, all everybody was interested in was who's going to do it for the lowest possible price. So I think we have matured a lot recently.
And Faye touches on that. You know, one of the comments she made during our chat that really hit home for me was that what would end up getting outsourced used to be whatever the CEO or the head of operations didn't want to touch themselves. It was really that your mess for less approach. And something that Faye brought up over the course of our chat today is that an outsourcer, if they're going to be successful, has to be able to go to a client or a prospective client with not just an understanding about how they can make service on the telephone better, but they've got to have the right technologies, they've got to have the right processes, they've got to have the right recruitment strategies and subject matter expertise. We touched on that a lot, and I think it's really important. Our most recent buyer study at Ryan Strategic Advisory indicated that one of the things that the BPO community has to understand is that the clients are going to expect certainly a great deal of industry level expertise. They want the outsourcer to know their industry as well as they, the client, know it.
Yeah, and this is important now. I mean, it's becoming like a real partnership. If a bank goes to a BPO and gets them on board, they don't want them just to answer calls. I mean, they want to be actually to have a partner that understands regulation, compliance, and how things might change in future. So they're kind of like eyes and ears for the future on how that bank needs to interact with their customers.
That's right. And this is something that Faye discussed at length over the course of our chat. It's that whole idea of an integrated partnership. We talked a little bit about how things can get off on the wrong foot between an outsourcer and a client. And something that Faye brought up that I think she'll explain very well and that the listeners will appreciate is the fact that in many cases, there have been historically the kickoff to an engagement where perhaps the goals and objectives of the outsourcer were different from those of the client. And really, it's like any type of a contract, it's just going to end up very badly in that case if they aren't able to align from the outset.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that I'm looking forward to hearing this again. But at the same time, listeners can actually look back into the past in some of the earlier podcasts that we did. Very recently, there was Paul O'Hara talking about partnerships and how we should be seeing the end of pricing BPO contracts with FTEs. And a little bit further back, Alistair Niederer from T-Tech was talking about orchestration and how like the complexity of running modern CX is far beyond what most companies can do internally today.
Yeah, you're bang on, Mark. And as we segue to Faye's interview, I will just say that we kicked off our discussion with the highlight that South Africa was tied for first place as the most favored offshore CX location with India this year. Obviously, Faye, being South African, is very proud of that. And certainly the legacy that she and her colleagues in South Africa have brought to the table have led to that great ranking. But from a little bit of fun standpoint, we also had a quick pop quiz on what her favorite Johnny Clegg song was of all time. I'm sure our listeners will very much enjoy that, and hopefully we'll be able to share their views on LinkedIn as well when we post the episode to the network in the not too distant future. One of the things that the CX Files enjoys is a lively conversation, and I'm fairly certain that we're going to have one today with Faye Joubert, who joins us from her home in Johannesburg, one of my favorite cities in the world. Faye, thank you so much for taking some time to chat to the CX Files listeners on this beautiful Thursday afternoon.
Thanks, Pete. It's an honor to be joining you from my offices in Randburg, Johannesburg. And I just want to say that I'm a bit nervous if you put me on the spot about the music quizzes, but the rest I think I can probably manage. So thanks very much for having me on CX Files. I'm honored to be here.
No, the honor is ours. And we wouldn't be starting the CX Files today without a music quiz for you. And my question is going to be, in honor of a true global musical icon, what would be your favorite Johnny Clegg song of all time?
Simbonanga, hands down. Translated is Have You Seen Him? It's an anthem of my growing up, and the song's still very special to me. And I think it's the best one on all the albums, actually.
I think that's a wonderful choice, and I truly enjoy that song even to this day. A loss for not just the musical world, but for the global community as well. We miss Johnny Clegg, I think, every day, and what he contributed to South Africa's movement for democracy, for equality, and as I said, just a true musical talent. But we're really excited to find out some of your thoughts today, Faye, in regards to the ongoing evolution of what relationships look like between enterprise CX decision makers and their outsourcing partners. Now, given your role of head of CRM at iSON, which is a leading BPO provider, given your employment history and what you've done over the course of your career, you're uniquely suited, I think, to give our listeners some real insight. So maybe a good starting point would be to get a sense from you, Faye, in your experience, what are the most important elements that historically have made a good relationship between a BPO and a CX client?
So Peter, I do feel like I'm positioned to answer some of these questions. I have spent a number of years on both ends of the table. And it's a really good question, and I expected no less from you. So I'm going to dive right in and say, perhaps controversially, it must be treated like a marriage. Fundamentally, a sound contract and a detailed scope of work can't be overestimated. So in the first rush of enthusiasm on both parts, much can be missed that can later become bones of contention. So these things may sound very self-explanatory and very obvious, but it's sometimes the most obvious things that get missed in the interaction. So things like payment terms, the ubiquitous SLAs, the targets, this must be dispassionately reviewed by both parties, and the hard questions asked about prior performance, whether that line of business was run internally as a captive possibly, or even if another colleague from the BPO trade, a previous vendor, had the business. As confident as we can be as a delivery partner, an outright failure by somebody else needs a bit of closer introspection and understanding. So I'm quite clear on that, and a mandate on who the decision makers are inside the client. The volume and cadence of meetings. Now, this might sound a bit obvious, but never underestimate the cost of bi-daily meetings to the rhythm of operations and management focus, and the ability to get the machine moving for the customer.
And it's interesting you talk about meetings and the impact that meetings can have on a relationship. And You've probably been following on LinkedIn recently, Faye. There's a lot of pushback about the number of meetings and the requirement for the get-togethers or the confabs, whatever you want to call them. And I think that talks a little bit about how there is a shift in the evolution of the relationship between the client and the outsourcer. What would you say would be, coming out of the pandemic, how do you feel this dynamic is going to continue to change? What are going to be some of the different factors that a client's going to be expecting in 2022 and beyond with regards to how they manage the relationship with a third party that perhaps weren't as indicative in the pre-2020, going back a few years period?
You're talking about our previous life, the pre-COVID life.
Yes,
it's
yes.
a great question. I must confess, Peter, I was one of those uneducated few who seemed to think our old life would come back. And for a long time, I clung to that, but I'm now completely woken up to the fact that this is the new world of work. So certainly the pandemic has taught us that being agile and seamlessly switching from work from home to work from office to work from anywhere will be expected as a hygiene factor. It's no longer the wow factor. We got the staff to work from home and kept your business moving. That is now expected. Saying things like we've been badly hit by the flu is unlikely to garner any support now. Clients expect engaged, hybrid, on-point staffing in their partners and a smooth, almost indiscernible crossover. Despite the various acts of God, let's talk just about the recent Durban floods outside of COVID. And last year, July, you may have heard a podcast I did there on our response to the July riots. In terms of various matters that come across our paths, COVID-19 is just one of them. So having said that, though, the cost of hybrid working is now finally being understood. And clients are, in turn, open to rates that now must necessarily include laptops, inverters, high-speed data, especially in a brownfield operation. In a greenfield space, there's an opportunity to co-create in terms of the workflow between hybrid work and in-office work. And we've recently done that with one of our new clients in the region. So basically, working from home and remote delivery is becoming the norm. It's just making us consider long-term location strategies and looking at optimizing cost, being resilient, and of course, my personal bugbear is access to the right talent. So this makes us a very effective and attractive offshoring destination. And I can't help but just insert here, Pete, thank you very much for calling out that we share with our good colleagues in India the top slot for best offshoring destination. So basically, the pandemic has forced us to prioritize listening to customers and acting on the feedback. So that's really where I think we are post-COVID, and that we're never going to bounce back. That is the bar has been set there, and that's the new requirement.
But isn't that fascinating, though, the idea that the outsourcers are now recognizing, or the outsourcing community and the executives in it are recognizing that there needs to be more thought. They need to be more thoughtful in terms of how they manage relationships, about the strategies that go into the relationship management and the evolving inputs that are going to go into that, as you say, Faye, and I think this is spot on. Work from home is now a structural part of how CX delivery is going to occur. That we aren't going back to the pre-2020 days when it was a niche delivery model. Now it is a fundamental part of how contact centers are going to operate. And I'm really pleased that we're going down this route in the conversation, because one of the things that's always fascinated me is how the relationships evolve over the course of a 2-year contract, a 5-year contract. And many times they go very, very well. But we've also, I think, been exposed to situations where things have fallen apart. Where do you think that the relationships tend to go bad? Where do they go foul between a partner, a third-party services partner, and an enterprise? And what can be avoided to make sure that this doesn't happen?
Indeed. And then, as you've said, the relationship becomes ever more important between vendor and client, but also back into the customers that we serve, that emotional linkage that is now required. So I really refer to my opening remarks, in the first flush of youth and excitement, everything is marvelous. And, the best laid plans of mice and men go awry when we are both anxious, tearing to get a proof of concept out the door, for example. Just pause for a moment, good people. Let's get that agreement in place and ensure the commercials make sense to both parties. And that we've really considered all elements. I mean, I'll give an example, Pete. When you're looking at a sales campaign, have you both parties looked at the data supply and the efficacy of that data? Is the product well thought out? Has the market research on take-up been done? The capacity and delivery times, do both partners really understand what that's about? Because that's a fundamental for a BPO or a GPS provider, is to understand capacity and delivery. And then my personal bugbear is training time. Has it been allocated? Is it not cut short? We can't catch it up later. There's an investment on both parts to get people to be deeply understanding of the customers that they're going to serve. So I also place a lot of stock in relationships. You've alluded to both of us working in this trade a number of years, and I always say it always be nice. It's a small town, whether you're the client or whether you're the delivery partner. But while I place a lot of stock on in relationships, these relationships are best preserved when there's not an overdependence on them, and that only comes out of what my friends at iSON always call the green boards. Organic flourishing happens when the metrics are being met. And I think that's the fundamental bedrock, but that can only happen if there's been honest and open communication, from the beginning. And then just lastly, I think and I have seen this evolution is definitely in place, where the line between vendor and client has become blurred, in that there's mutual ownership of upstream issues, and there's an openness to discuss things that are affecting the downstream customer without fear of offense or reprisal, and just genuine open examinations of things that might cause customer disaffection that can then in turn be reintegrated back into the organization, and they can effect the changes that are needed.
You have raised something that I've picked up on over the course of the years. If I was to go through my LinkedIn network and take a look at the number of executives that have joined outsourcing firms, previously having worked for clients, it's just a huge number of people. And it seems that there's been a lot of overlap with outsourcing managers going to work for enterprises on the CX side, CX leaders at enterprises coming to work for BPOs. And you would think that there would be a much better understanding and a much greater level of coherence between the two sides. But I still hear a lot of stories where, going back to what you were saying at the outset of your answer, Faye, there is not necessarily those common goals that are laid out, and both sides have different expectations, which invariably is going to lead to issues.
Yes. And I think, I've said it, I think twice, and I don't want to be redundant, Pete. I think if we can just pause in that first flush of excitement when we sign on a new partner or we join as vendor manager at an organization, take a deep breath and say, how did I get here? None of us have been dropped on top of a mountaintop. Everybody has taken the path. What are the learnings that we've had in our respective careers, whether they be as delivery partner or whether they be as client? And just pausing and really understanding what went wrong, when did it go wrong, and how can we avoid it? It really does sound obvious, doesn't it? But just pause, look at the commercials, understand the data, understand the service level agreement, and understand where either the captive has failed before, or another vendor, or portions of failure, and how they can be avoided going forward. And that really just comes off the back of brutal honesty. And that's, we're also quick to sign an NDA, but that's the principle of an NDA, is that we sit down and we really talk about it, warts and all. That would be my advice.
But I think you're spot on. I mean, the reality is that you need to understand both the good and the bad. And
Yes.
if there has been a failure in the past, if there have been disconnects in the past where the enterprise has not been able to manage its CX properly, it's turning to an outsourcer. The outsourcer has to know exactly where some of those failings have occurred.
Yes. Without anybody feeling embarrassed, and there's no need for it. It's just to say, look, we weren't successful with X and Y. We're hoping for better performance. And this is what we think we can bring to the table. So it doesn't need to be a difficult conversation. It should be absolute hygiene inside the outsourcing model.
So then, Faye, given your experience on both sides of the equation, I'm curious, what would be perhaps the 2 to 3 pieces of counsel you would give a BPO operator as we move into a post-pandemic period, if they're going to be successful in terms of managing existing and new relationships?
So, Pete, I'm very reluctant to set myself up as a as the only voice or expert in the space, remember that I too am learning every day, and there's been a huge evolution.
Aren't we all?
In the outsourcing space? And I read your articles and I listen to other podcasts. My boss sent me a great podcast this morning to listen to, just to understand what's been said in the CX space. So if I can just take a deep breath and say, I think that as an organization, as you do with your own personal skills, we all need to know what our deep skills are. If you know a bit about me, I believe passionately in the 5 skills. Everybody has something that they do to a black belt degree of success, 5 or 6 things that you're really, really good at. So too, institutionally, you need to know what that is. You need a deep institutional knowledge of what you can turn on successfully, quickly, and replicate. And have a people strategy inside your own firm that can weather the many storms that come with GBS or BPO. I never know what we're calling ourselves these days, but you need a team that can help you weather the various storms that happen inside the organization. And then knowing your customer and their needs. I mean, there's a recent Accenture report, which was very helpful for me, that shows that organizations are now moving away from CX, as we used to call it, to the business of experience. So it's articulated in that an organization is now moving from not just optimizing touch points where an outsourcer can be part of touch points around products or services, but arranging the entire organization to solve those human needs. And there's some firms that are doing it really well. They understand that their own growth is completely predicated by the experience that the customer has. So, with all these buzzwords, solve the customer's problem. But if you help the customers achieve what's important to them, the sale happens by itself, the upsell happens by itself. So yes, I think that a deep knowledge of your customer and their needs, and a knowledge of yourself and what you offer as an organization, and just trying to marry those 2 points.
Right. And I think that's outstanding counsel. So let's flip it around then. Put yourself in the shoes of an enterprise CX decision maker, and you're looking to select a new BPO partner. What should you be expecting them to come to the table with? What are you going to be looking to see as they are coming down the catwalk and presenting themselves as a potential partner to your organization to provide the best possible digital and voice-based interactions?
Only you could get away with a catwalk remark, exactly, because we're all on our best behavior in an RFP, and we've all got great people.
Exactly.
And there's an exceptional people in the BPO space, and you and I know hundreds of them in our network. But I think what enterprises know now is that the industry has evolved, and they are expecting, almost just a restatement of what I said in terms of what you need to know well, is a deep understanding of service levels, lines of business, and a knowledge of lessons learned, and good case studies of both wins and losses, and deep understanding of how either the great success occurred or conversely where there has more work to be done. So the enterprise is completely aware that the market is full. There's a lot of good vendors, but they absolutely expect an evolved partner. They're also looking for extreme agility, somebody who can actually take the journey with them on the entire CX life cycle, not someone who does a portion of the work. You might remember a time, Pete, where an organization would dump a line of business in the outsourcing space, a murky line of business that the CEO didn't like much or didn't understand, or even the marketing director didn't understand. Now the client understands that line of business only too well, but have chosen for whatever reason to outsource that business as non-core to them so they can focus on their manufacturing or their payment platforms or their market share. But the customer now knows that business line. You're not going to be educating him on his business. So agile, highly educated, and they're expecting peace of mind. We are supposed to provide people, technology, processes, and infrastructure, and we need to do it in the space of ever-changing needs. Have I just described an impossible task, like Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill? But that's outsourcing. If you don't like it, you have to get out the business.
Yeah, go find another job. Go stack shelves. Supermarkets are clamoring. Yeah, supermarkets are clamoring for labor right now. At least they are in Canada. Look, the reality is, I think you've touched on something that's really important. That's subject matter expertise. In fact, I can tell you, Faye, that in my most recent Omnibus survey, the front office CX Omnibus survey that was published last week, One of the things that really stood out was the fact that enterprises put a huge amount of emphasis on subject matter expertise or industry expertise as it stands. They expect an outsourcer to know their sector as well as they know it. And I think that's something that the BPO community is going to have to come to terms with very quickly.
We need to, Peter, but I couldn't say it better. You have summarized it perfectly. There's a deep expectation that we know it as well, if not better.
Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. And as I was saying in the pre-game show, Faye, we like to have conversations here. And this has been a great conversation, one of the best that I've had. Can't wait to see you live in South Africa. Hopefully you get over to this side of the pond one of these days too. But thank you for taking some time and chatting to the CX Files.
Thanks, Pete. Hopefully not coming to pack shelves, but I don't want to ever minimize the fantastic work done in retail. My first job was packing shopping in a supermarket. And
my first job. No, it's, to be fair, my first job was working at Safeway pushing carts, as was the first job of my co-host Mark Hillary. I did it in Canada, Mark did it in the UK. I have a huge appreciation for for especially the grocery sector.
There we go. So we started in CX where we needed to, right? Thanks,
exactly.
Peter. It's an honor to be on your show, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow's music poll, and I hope I get it right this time.
There's no wrong answers on the music poll.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. We really appreciate your feedback and suggestions. You can reach myself, Mark Hillary, or Peter Ryan via LinkedIn. Please also leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast provider, as that helps more people to find us. As always, we'd like to thank Chris Haig at Traction Media for the CX Files graphics. See you next week.